Hello everyone. On behalf of the GATS tutoring program, I would like to invite all the students to make use of a new initiative, which is the AP tutoring video series. So what we've done in this is our qualified students have basically broken the AP subjects unit by unit into simple 10-minute videos. We hope that these videos will come in handy for your test prep or for the AP exam prep. The subjects that we have worked on so far are AP World, AP Biology, AP Human, AP Psychology, and AP Calc AB. So if you would like to watch more videos like this, please be sure to subscribe to our GATS YouTube channel. And also, if you would like to be part of this initiative, please email us at gats-tutoring@gatamilsangam.org. Thank you.
Welcome back to this AP Psychology series. Today we're going to be talking about the Unit 2, which is Biological Bases of Behavior, which composes around 8 to 10% of the AP exam. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is the interaction between heredity and the environment, and the main thing you need to know here is the nature versus nurture debate. Essentially, there's two different opposing viewpoints in psychology. There's this viewpoint that nature is responsible, our genes are responsible for most of our physical our activities or our actions, and there's this thing that nurture is responsible for a lot of these things, which is essentially your environment and your a different like upbringing and stuff. So the general consensus is that environment has a large effect on our genes, but it's not the only deciding factor. And the way we decided this is through twin studies, where we proved that even when twins are split apart in different like households, which is really unethical. They literally took two fraternal twins or two identical twins and split them apart and figured out the extent of genes effect on their IQs. And they found that, yes, they had very similar IQs, but they weren't the exact same IQ, and they were sometimes closer to their parents, their foster parents. Okay, let's talk about, now that we've discussed that, let's talk about neurons. So a neuron is essentially a cell inside our brains, right? And it's very similar to a lot of cells, as it has a nucleus and a soma, which is a cell body, but it's also very different. The thing that really like strikes you when you first see this neuron is the dendrites, right? They are those branches. And essentially dendrites receive incoming signals. Those signals are going to transfer, travel through the nucleus, through the axon, and the Schwann cells and the node of Ranviers are just there to essentially aid it. It'll jump through the node of Ranviers to go faster. The signal will jump through the node of Ranviers to go faster. And the myelin is like a protective coating. So all of that is just there to help the signal go faster. And then it reaches the axon terminal, where it gets transferred to the next neuron. And that happens really, really quickly. So let's talk about the neural firing process. We have action and resting potentials. An action potential is when a neuron fires, and a resting potential is when that neuron has the ability to fire. And it fires with something called the all or nothing response. It either fires completely, right? Or it fires with nothing at all. It can't fire. There's no like halfway firing. There's also polarization. So when the neuron is about to fire, it polarizes. And then when it fires, it depolarizes, and then it repolarizes so it can fire again. So that there's this brief refractory period where the neuron can't fire at all. And that's one thing to notice. It's a very small refractory period, but it does exist. And it essentially says that a very small amount of time exists where the neuron cannot fire. And then sodium and potassium essentially act as a pump. Whenever there is, so a neuron fires when there's negative ions in the neuron. If essentially sodium and potassium are positive, so they act to bring out that negative ions and replenish it whenever it needs to fire again. Okay, now let's talk about neurotransmitters. So get ready to memorize these because there's a lot of them. First of all, let's talk about acetylcholine. So first of all, you have to memorize all of them. By the way, on the AP exam, all of them are tested. There's no way out of it. You have to memorize it. But let's talk about acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that enables muscle action, learning, and memory. And without it, you're going to have Alzheimer's disease. Dopamine influences movement, learning, attention, and emotion. It's the reward neurotransmitter. And excess dopamine activity is linked to schizophrenia, and too little is linked to Parkinson's disease. It's when you have tremors and you struggle to like move. Serotonin, it affects mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal, and an undersupply can link to depression because serotonin makes you happy. It affects mood. So if you have too little, like, yeah, you're going to be depressed. Norepinephrine and epinephrine control alertness and arousal, and an undersupply can depress your mood. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. An undersupply is linked to seizures, tremors, and insomnia. And glutamate is the excitatory neurotransmitter involved in memory. And an oversupply can overstimulate the brain. That makes sense. If it's exciting you, then it's going to overstimulate the brain. GABA inhibits you, it's also a calming neurotransmitter. So if you have too little of the calming chemical, then you're going to get seizures or tremors or insomnia. Things that happen when you're not calm. And neurotransmitters bind to the neurons. So essentially, what you're going to learn later is that drugs can replicate those neurotransmitters and bind to neurons, which will essentially simulate the same kind of effect that these neurotransmitters might have. Okay, let's talk about the parts of the nervous system. So there's a lot of different parts, obviously. There's two main parts, right? There's the central nervous system and there's the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system contains the brain and the spinal cord. And the brain essentially, I mean, we know what the brain does. It essentially orders different muscles around and makes sure that your muscles are, it makes sure that your heartbeat is normal and your sleep is normal. It regulates hunger and all those different things. So yeah, the brain does a lot of different things. And then the spinal cord is essentially the pathway that connects that brain and the rest of the nervous system, which is called the peripheral nervous system, which transmits information from the central nervous system up to the brain, and vice versa. That's what the spinal cord does. It's essentially that midway. There's two parts of the peripheral nervous system. There's the autonomic nervous system, where you can think of it as automatic because it regulates automatic functions. And there's two divisions of that. There's the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. The sympathetic division prepares the body to react in stress, so it's your fight or flight response. And this parasympathetic essentially calms you down after that fight or flight response. So a lot of people with chronic stress, it's a problem with their sympathetic nervous system, where essentially the sympathetic nervous system is putting out too much stress and it's making your hunger go down and it's making you fatigued because you're not supposed to be in that state. That's why the parasympathetic division exists. So it can bring you back to normal conditions. But if you have chronic stress, then that doesn't happen. And that's why a lot of people struggle when they have chronic stress and they're fatigued. And then there's another part of the nervous system. It's called the somatic nervous system, and it carries sensory information. It also controls the movement of the skeletal muscles. Essentially what that means is there's two parts of that. There's the sensory nervous system, which essentially, if I touch a wooden desk or something like that, then the sensory nervous system, like my sensory neurons, are going to carry that information up to my brain and tell me I'm touching wood. And then the motor nervous system will do the exact opposite. It's going to go from the brain to my arm, and it's going to tell my arm to touch wood. And then that information gets transmitted up to my brain. There's two different types of neurons there. So those are called motor neurons and sensory neurons. Sensory neurons are for the sensory system, and motor neurons are for the motor system. You could also hear this referring to as afferent and efferent. Afferent neurons for the sensory and efferent neurons for the motor. And there's also one other type of neurons called the interneurons, which connect the brain and the spinal cord together. Any neurons inside the brain, those are all interneurons. Okay, let's talk about the endocrine system, which is completely different from the nervous system as it's a lot slower. It controls your body's hormones, and the pituitary gland is essentially the master gland of the endocrine system. So when you go through, when a person goes through puberty, it's their endocrine system sending hormones, telling them to go through all those changes, like growing in height or getting deeper. All that stuff is done by the endocrine system. All right, then let's talk about the brain. So there's a lot of different parts of the brain. There is the frontal lobe, which is involved in your thinking and your problem solving. The parietal lobe, which is your perception and your a lot of knowledge. Those two are very interchangeable, but parietal lobe, think more about sensation and perception. That's unit 3. We're going to be talking about a lot of that. And the occipital lobe is vision. The funny thing is, the occipital lobe is in the very back of your head, even though it's dealing with the very front of your head, which is vision. obviously I didn't design the brain like that. It is evolution which designed the brain like that. We don't know. I mean, evolution's just plays a hand in whatever it wants to do, and it does this. It's unpredictable. The temporal lobe is involved in hearing and language, and you'll learn about this a little bit later. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but the temporal lobe includes two famous areas of the brain. The brain stem controls all your like essential functions that you don't think about on a daily basis, like your heartbeat or your breathing, everything else that's done automatically that you never have to think about. And the cerebellum is known as the little brain. It performs a lot of important functions, but the main function we know it for is balance. Let's also talk about the limbic system. This is another part of the brain that you need to be familiar with. The hypothalamus is essentially responsible for keeping you in homeostasis, which is like your sense of like regular operation, like regular blood pressure, regular heartbeat, and everything. The hypothalamus maintains that. The amygdala and the hippocampus are really, I mean, if you look, they're connected, right? But the hippocampus stores memories and the amygdala stores emotions. It's kind of interesting. Whenever the AP exam asks a question pertaining to emotions, it's always going to be the amygdala, but they'll try to trick you by saying, they'll try to trick you by saying a memory associated with emotion, like an emotional memory, and the answer is still amygdala. It's not hippocampus, even though hippocampus does regulate memories. And then there's also the hypothalamus, which is technically part of the brainstem, which relays information from the brainstem to the rest of the body, rest of the brain. So, okay. There's also a ton of different brain scans, and this is how we figure out all these different things about the brain. So first we have PET scans, which are essentially positron emission tomography. All you need to know about that is that they essentially scan the glucose inside of the brain so they can figure out very accurately what parts of the brain are active and not. There's CT scans, which is essentially computed tomography. It's just an image of your brain. And MRIs are the same thing. It's just an image of your brain with a different technology. fMRIs are interesting as they combine the MRI and the PET scans. So they allow you to have a very detailed image of the brain, and you can see where the glucose is going, where the blood is going in your brain, so you can figure out what parts of your brain are really active. That's very important in diagnosing certain brain patients. If you want to figure out what parts of a schizophrenic brain are active, then you can figure out more of why schizophrenia happens, and you can learn a lot from that. And then finally, you have EEG, which they essentially hook up a ton of kind of wires to your brain, and they figure out where electrical signals are being sent, because your brain is basically a computer. It sends electrical signals. Okay, let's talk about these two areas in the brain. So this is in the temporal lobe, and it's essentially two areas of the brain that were discovered by two scientists, Braca and Paul Braca and Carl Wernicke, who discovered Braca's area and Wernicke's area, respectively. Braca's area facilitates speaking and language production, and Wernicke's area is responsible for speech understanding. They both named their areas after themselves because I guess scientists are narcissists. Moving on, we also want to talk about psychoactive drugs. So there's three different types of drugs, and here we're going to have to memorize again. But notice how I said before, I said that drugs like try to mimic neurotransmitters. So you'll see how these drugs essentially, stimulants will obviously increase the activity of the nervous system, and they do that by increasing certain neurotransmitters, and depressants decrease the activity of the nervous system by decreasing the amount of neurotransmitters. And hallucinogens are completely different. They cause hallucinations and vivid imagery and imagination of things that just don't exist. Okay, so here are some psychoactive drugs to memorize. We're going to go through them. Alcohol is a depressant. It usually has a initial high and followed by relaxation, and it mimics the effects of GABA, which is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter, so it calms you down. And adverse effects include depression, memory loss, and all the bad things that come with alcohol. Same with heroin. It's also a depressant, and there's usually a rush of euphoria, but adverse effects include an agonizing withdrawal, and it's very, very deadly. So yeah, don't. And then caffeine is a stimulant. It has increased alertness, so that's why people feel a lot more awake. But at the same time, you also struggle to go back to sleep when you take caffeine, so that's another problem. Methamphetamine is a stimulant. It usually comes with euphoria, but some adverse effects include irritability and insomnia. Cocaine is a stimulant. It's also associated with a rush of euphoria, and there's a lot of other problems with it. And after you take cocaine, usually after you get off of it, there's usually this crash that comes off after that. So it's generally not, I mean, obviously none of these drugs are good. Nicotine is also a stimulant. It has arousal and relaxation. It's usually in cigarettes, but it can also lead to heart disease and cancer, and it tightens your blood vessels. In addition to that, if you take it through cigarettes, well, you're also going to have lung cancer and all those problems. Ecstasy is a stimulant. It has emotional elevation, and essentially you don't feel much because this is again is a calming drug. And some of the problems are dehydration, overheating, and a lot of other problems with your mood and your cognitive function. And lastly, we have marijuana, which is a mild hallucinogen, which has enhanced sensation and relief of pain, but also causes impaired learning and memory from what we know. There's also one more that you need to know that's not on here, which is LSD, which is another hallucinogen. Just know that it's a hallucinogen, and it's a much stronger hallucinogen than marijuana or ecstasy. Okay, now let's talk about sleep and dreams. So with sleep, we have 4 stages, and then we have REM sleep, which is essentially rapid eye movement. That's where most of the recovery happens in your brain. So if you look, the REM sleep gets bigger and bigger as the time goes on. And the first 4 stages, transition from, easy to awake to harder to awake. So these are EEG recordings that we recorded during sleep of a random person, probably. While you're awake, you emit beta waves. While you're in stage 1, which is when you're just about to fall into sleep, you emit alpha waves. And when you're in stage 2, you emit theta waves, which are interesting because they're not that high, as you can see, but there's sudden bursts of activity in those theta waves, and we call those sleep spindles. And we don't know the exact function, but we have to assume that it's something to do with recovery and how your brain is trying to process information. Stage 3 are delta waves, and usually those are a little bit higher. And REM sleep is very, very low and very, very fast frequency waves. It's when your brain is doing a lot of recovery, and it's that's the most important part of your sleep. And that's why they say get all 8 hours, because your REM sleep is the most in the last few hours. Let's talk about some of the sleep disorders that you need to know for the exam. There's insomnia, which is essentially sleeplessness, extreme feelings of sleeplessness. You just can't go to sleep, and there's obviously drugs for that to take care of that. There's narcolepsy, which is extreme drowsiness during the daytime. So it's the exact opposite. Even if you fall asleep correctly and you sleep the whole 8 hours, you feel extremely drowsy during the daytime. There's night terrors, where you scream and flail your arms while asleep. It usually happens to kids. Sleep apnea is when your breathing gets really shallow during your sleep, so you're unable to breathe properly. Sleepwalking is when you sleep and you walk in the middle of night. There's no description for that one because it's simply, that's what sleepwalking is. And usually it happens while the person is unconscious. REM sleep behavior disorder is whenever you have problems with REM sleep. So you might twitch during your REM sleep, which is not supposed to happen because you're supposed to be completely paralyzed when you're in REM sleep. And then dream theories is the last thing we're going to talk about. We have wish fulfillment. So we have different theories to why dreams happen, right? So these different theories are the ones you need to know for the exam, right? So first is wish fulfillment, which is a Freudian theory that our wishes are carried out in our dreams. So what if I wish to be a superhero, I'm going to be a superhero in my dream. Information processing is how the brain organizes memories while it's sleeping. So the brain is just dreaming to organize all the memories, and all that brain function is just those memories being organized. Physiological function is that dreams will serve a physiological function to process issues in our lives. This makes sense. A person that's very stressed, or a person that's has a lot more nightmares. A person that's blind has a lot more nightmares of being stuck in a random location, because those are things that would be scary to a blind person. And that's the kind of things that they need to be alert. So that helps them. If you're blind, think of it from a survival perspective. The world is very scary. So from a survival perspective, it makes sense for the brain to give you these nightmares. It makes you more alert. But yeah, that's just a phenomenon that happens. Activation synthesis theory is a weird one because it says that there's random neural firing in the brain, right? We know that neural firing exists in the brain while we're sleeping. So maybe our body is trying to recover, and then random neural firing is it trying to recover. But the brain also likes to interpret things, right? Our brain interprets things that don't seem completely real as real. And it likes to make sense of the world. That's just a general thing that it likes to do. So maybe that our dreams are just random neural firing being interpreted by the brain as dreams. And last, we have cognitive development, which is essentially that dreams help people solve their problems in real life. So if you're going through a tough time, maybe that dream will offer you a solution, or maybe help you think through it, or it might just help you develop as a person in general. Those are all the dream theories. So that's all of Unit 2 recapped. Next time we'll do Unit 3, which is sensation and perception. I will see you in the next one.